Good afternoon. Welcome to the Rhode Island edition of our state webinar series exploring the findings from American Farmland Trust's recently released Farms Under Threat, the State of the States report. Before we get started, let me run through some quick logistics. Everyone has been muted, so no need to do that yourself. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, you can do so by going to the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. That orange arrow at the top of the panel allows the panel to shrink and reopen. You'll see a questions section of the control panel. You can pop that section out by clicking on the little square on the right-hand side. That decouples it from the control panel, and then you can type your question or comment in there. We will allow plenty of time for Q&A during and after the presentation. We're also recording the webinar and we'll send the link of the recording to everyone who registered. Please feel free to share this recording with others. So let me now introduce myself. I'm Chris Coffin, American Farmland Trust's Senior Policy Advisor. I also direct our newly launched National Agricultural Land Network, which I'll talk about at the end of the webinar. Co-hosting with me are Nate Latoile, AFT's New England Director, and Jamie Pottern, AFT's New England Program Manager. And for those of you not familiar with AFT, let me do a very quick introduction. We're a national nonprofit membership organization founded in 1980. We believe that saving the land that sustains us means focusing not just on retaining and protecting the agricultural land base, but on the management of that land as well, and on the farmers, ranchers, and landowners who work the land. We work from kitchen tables to the halls of Congress, from direct land protection to soil health and water quality initiatives, to training service providers to help a new generation of farmers and ranchers gain access to land. Our programming and research inform our state and federal policy development and advocacy. We have 6 regional offices and a national office in Washington, D.C. And with that, let me turn it over to Nate.
Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're delighted to be joined by a number of valued partners on this call, including the South Kingston Land Trust, Westerly Land Trust, Narrow River Land Trust, Rhode Island Land Trust Council, the Livestock Institute, Conservation Law Foundation, Social Enterprise Greenhouse, African Alliance of Rhode Island, Farm Fresh Rhode Island, Land for Good, and a wonderful variety of farmers from across the state. We'd also like to recognize and thank the Natural Resource Conservation Service, especially for their collaboration and support of this project. They've been an integral partner, as has our research partner in this project, Conservation Science Partners. I'd also now like to welcome a very special guest on our webinar today, the Chief of the Rhode Island Division of Agriculture, Ken Ayers. Ken, thank you so much for taking some time to be with us today.
My pleasure, happy to be here.
So Ken, Rhode Island ranks 8th overall on our policy scorecard and has had a robust farmland protection program for decades. Recently, it's been a real innovator on farmland access issues. Yet, as this study shows, farmland does continue to be converted. In fact, about 3,600 acres in the last 15-year period between 2001 and 2016, including about 1,700 acres the report identifies as nationally significant agricultural land. What do you see as the biggest threat that's driving this continued conversion?
Well, I think there's a number of things. Farmland is very expensive in Rhode Island, the highest in the country typically in terms of its real estate value. That puts pressure on land to be converted. Rhode Island is an incredibly beautiful state with a very high development pressure, and that's part of the factor. And the money that we appropriate towards farmland protection, which is always approved by the voters of the state, that's the way our funding program works, doesn't go as far because of the high cost of land. So when you think that since we really began in earnest to protect farmland in the early 1980s, following a report by farmers in the governor's office, we've protected since that time 116 farms, 8,000 acres, and that's cost $100 million all told. $100 million in other state might go a lot farther than it went in Rhode Island, but it's attributable to the very, very high cost of land, the value of it. But it also, I think, shows the commitment of the state and partners to achieve farmland protection goals. Of that $100 million, about a little bit over a third of that was state funding, about a third of that was partner funding, and a little bit less than a third was federal funding. So, I mean, there are a lot of people involved in farmland protection in Rhode Island. Money's been appropriated. It's very expensive and challenging in a state like this because of the high cost of land to protect it. So going forward, we need to just keep appropriating money, fighting the fight, protecting farmland, and going as quick and hard as we can to achieve that goal.
Thank you. Thank you. In addition to that easement-based protection, AFT has really recognized Rhode Island for really leaning in on farmland access. Would you share with us briefly why you've done that and what steps you've taken on that front?
We don't view farmland protection as only buying the development rights. There's the economic side of having a viable agricultural industry, which is actually the first priority to keeping farmland in use. When farms are viable, they can be passed down from generation to generation. They could withstand development pressures and the other market pressures that often drive people out. So first and foremost is to put our effort into the agricultural economy. Protecting land is part of that. But we also recognize that there are scenarios that we have to continually tweak to make it work for young and beginning farmers that don't have often the wherewithal or access to land, and to find innovative ways of helping them to achieve their access. So in this case, we look at land that we own as a state. The state of Rhode Island, through the Department of Environment Management, owns a fair amount of farmland, and we find ways to lease it to young and beginning farmers and farmers of all sorts, not just young and beginning, through land that we own. But another innovative thing that we've tried recently is to, as a state agency, buy farmland, own it in fee, and then us sell it at a reduced price to farmers based upon the agricultural value. What that does is that takes out the market pressure, which typically drives up the cost of farmland. One of the things that we've seen is that when farmland is protected, even though you knock the price down, sometimes the value goes up more than we'd like to see because it has its own value as protected land. That makes it hard for the next farmer to buy it. So when we own it, we're not concerned about market pressure. We're not going to let the price be inflated. We'll sell it at only the appraised value to the next farmer. That's the heart and soul of Farmland Access Program, and that's what we're trying to achieve.
Thanks, Ken. That's a fabulous tool. In that line of other tools, are there additional tools that you think would help Rhode Island to continue the pace of conversion?
As I mentioned previously, I think we have to look at this holistically. There are other tools that we can use, such as the Rhode Island passed a law 4 or 5 years ago, making it the right of any citizen in Rhode Island to grow their own food. That overrides all zoning. So when you think about using land for the purpose that we protect farmland, which is to preserve our right to grow food and agricultural products, allowing citizens to have that right is important. Continuing to protect farmland, spending money to do so, making sure that the tax value is consistent with agricultural land, which we do through a program just like many other states in Rhode Island called Farm, Forest, Open Space. Continually focusing on the agricultural economy, supporting young and beginning farmers, and making sure from a policy perspective that we have goals. One of the goals that we have, for example, in Rhode Island is consistent with the New England food vision of 50% of our food being produced locally by the year 2050. When you have that overarching goal, it frames why farmland is important. And especially, going through what we've just gone through with COVID and are still going through, where the demand for local agricultural products literally skyrocketed during this crisis, not that it wasn't high before. It just continually demonstrates the value and the need for these overarching policy goals that affirm the value of local food and agriculture.
Great. Thank you so much, Ken. Your perspectives and insights are always extraordinarily valuable. And thank you, Nathan, for that introduction. So now we're going to turn to the findings from the State of the States, which is the second in this research series. And Ken and Nate, we will come back to you in a bit. State of the States paints a striking picture of the threats facing working farms and ranches in every state and documents the steps every state has taken to protect their agricultural land base from development. We used a multi-pronged approach that included advanced spatial mapping to identify the threats to agricultural land and an in-depth analysis of state policy responses. We're using this report to raise public awareness, to inform state and federal policy, and to encourage more direct and permanent agricultural land protection. For those of you who didn't join us for our launch webinars in May, I want to touch really quickly on the national findings that you see here. We looked at the period 2001 to 2016, a period of historically low housing starts with a deep recession in the midst. Nonetheless, the U.S. converted 11 million acres of agricultural land during this 15-year period. That's equivalent to all the land planted in the U.S. as a whole to fruits, nuts, and vegetables in 2017. The majority of the conversion was to low-density residential land use. We've known this type of conversion was happening because across the country, scattered large lot housing has been fragmenting and disrupting farming and ranching for years. But until this report, no one has ever been able to map it and measure it. And once we mapped it, we realized just how big of a threat it is. Importantly, also, more than 4.4 million acres of the land converted was some of the best land in the United States, land that we've identified as nationally significant land, land that is best suited for intensive food and crop production. As you can see from this next slide, Rhode Island, despite all of the great efforts, whoops, I guess we don't have that next slide. So there, in looking at slides, if it had been there, it would have been it's 6th in the report's list of the top 12 most threatened states, and that's because of the percent of its agricultural land base that is being converted. It is not alone amongst the New England states, but it is also joined by states in the South that have a significant amount of acreage being lost. So in addition, now going to the next slide, in addition to the National Farms Under Threat State of the States report, we were lucky to receive funding to produce a regional Farms Under Threat report that weaves together some of the national spatial and policy findings with some specific New England findings. So I'm going to turn it over now to Jamie, our New England program manager, to briefly talk about this perspective.
Great, thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. So glad you could be here with us today. Yeah, so this past winter, my colleague at AFT, Laura Barley, and I co-authored this regional report, Farms Under Threat, a New England Perspective. And if you haven't read the report, a little bit about it is it dives a little deeper into the New England region as a whole and also draws on a variety of other reports and data sets like the USDA Agricultural Census, a New England Food Vision, and also draws on our ongoing work funded by Farm Credit East and CoBank. The report goes beyond the farmland itself, and it also examines threats and opportunities for New England's farm viability and its farmers. And it centers on issues of justice, equity, and climate change, and provides recommendations for how we might achieve greater regional resilience for the future. So we encourage you to download and read the report, which you can find on AFT's Farmland Information Center. We've also got the link right there on the slide. And I wanted to mention too, I'm also available to present on these findings to your community. If you'd like us to mail you a copy, please feel free to put your name and address there in the questions box. We'll definitely send you one. So please feel free to reach out to me with any questions, and I'll stick around at the end for the Q&A session. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you, Jamie. So now we're going to dive into the data available for Rhode Island on a new interactive website that was built for this project, and we will be ably assisted in this cruise through the website by our colleague Beth Frazier. So thank you, Beth. We're going to start by pointing out this tab, the Reports and Data tab here on the right-hand side. This is where you will find the full report. You'll find the executive summary. You'll find back sheets on the scorecard and the score sheets, and you will find descriptions of the methodology we used both around the low-density residential land use and around the PVR values that we'll talk about. If you are interested in receiving the spatial data layers that we have used in this report, where Beth has the cursor, this Geospatial Data Layers tab, if you click on that, it will take you to a form that you can fill out, and we will be back in touch with information about when the data layers will be available. So now we're going to go to the drop-down menu. We'll choose Rhode Island. And from here, you can access both the spatial data and the policy scorecard. And we're going to start with the spatial data. But before we even go there, we're going to point out this nifty 2-page Rhode Island conversion summary, which is down here in the lower left that Beth just clicked on. It is an easily downloadable 2-page PDF that has a lot of the most pertinent information, and we hope that you all will find this usable, easily downloadable, as opposed to the 68-page full report. There is a policy summary as well, so that these 2 short summaries you can link to from a website. You can put the infographics on your website. You can use them to have conversations with local policymakers and state policymakers. So we hope that they will be useful. But now we're going to turn to the 4 categories of spatial data we've created and mapped here. We're going to start with land cover and use. We used multiple national data sets to develop the best available spatial inventory of agricultural land use in the US. You can zoom in on this data layer to identify every type of land use in the state, including land that we've identified as low density residential development, and that is the orange, the lighter orange, not that sort of deep blood red orange, which is urban. We've also included a first ever attempt to spatially identify woodland associated with a farm or a ranch as identified through the Census of Agriculture. Our mapping shows 56,000 acres of agricultural land in Rhode Island, including 13,300 acres of cropland, 16,200 acres of pasture, and 26,400 acres of woodland associated with farms. So now we're going to move to PVR values. Here, we wanted to analyze the quality of land that is being lost to development, not just the quantity. So we created, with the help of a national panel of experts, an index to quantify the productivity, versatility, and resiliency of every acre of land in the US. This map shows the range of those PVR values across the state. The darker the green, the higher the PVR value, and the higher the PVR value, the higher the suitability of the land for long-term intensive crop production, especially for food crops such as fruits, nuts, vegetables, and staple grains. These PVR values in turn were used to identify nationally significant land, and that's the next data layer you can access from this website. This is this maps the nationally significant land in agricultural land in Rhode Island. There's 27,600 acres that fall into this category, which represents almost 50% of the state's agricultural land base. About 12,000 acres of this is cropland, with the rest split pretty equally between pasture and woodland. And we'll come back to some of these in just a minute, but let's go to the last category of conversion. So again, we're mapping this from a 15-year period, 2001 to 2016. We mapped the conversion into 2 types of land use. The first is the conversion we're used to seeing and to mapping. So urban and high density residential, commercial, and industrial development typically around the edges of cities and towns. This category, though, also includes rural industrial and energy production sites, including any oil and gas well pads and or large-scale solar installations. The second type is low-density residential development, or LDR, as we've nicknamed it. LDR areas range from lower density subdivisions to rural areas where more and more individual houses are being built. Rhode Island bucks the national trend here in that a majority of the conversion, 64%, was to urban and highly developed land, with just 36% of conversion to this low density residential development. What's important to note, though, about the LDR is, one, that it is still a threat in Rhode Island, two, that our way of looking at it has been through a model, and three, that there may well be active agriculture on some land designated as LDR. Some of these small parcels may be highly productive and profitable farmland, but we know that LDR tends to be a transitional land use. Land in Rhode Island that was considered low-density residential land use in 2001 was 5 times more likely to be converted to urban and highly developed land by 2016 than other agricultural land. And we know that continued conversion to LDR creates management challenges for producers who have to adjust to farming in and around non-farm neighbors. Total ag land converted over this time period was 3,600 acres. This represents almost 4% of Rhode Island's agricultural land base in 2001. Land converted consisted of 500 acres of cropland, 1,700 acres of pasture, and 1,300 acres of woodland associated with farms. And about 47% of the land converted was land considered nationally significant. The reason we say this is because the loss of this especially productive land is concerning. First, from an ag viability perspective, as producers are forced to more marginal land, input costs for them tend to go up and crop yields tend to go down. And from an environmental perspective, the loss of this more productive land creates more pressure to convert woodlands, pastures, and buffer strips to cropland. So reducing conversion to development is critical to making progress on water quality and wildlife habitat goals. And so with that, I'm going to stop and turn it back to Nate for some perspectives on these findings.
Sure, thank you, Chris. One of the, actually, Beth, but if we could swap over to the nationally significant layer for a moment, I think I'd like to start there. And if we zoom in just a little bit, we don't have to go real deep yet, but let's zoom in a little bit. I think what most people involved in agriculture in Rhode Island will be pleased to see is that our mapping shows there's nationally significant agricultural lands in virtually every community of Rhode Island. We've tried to take a very nuanced approach to what is nationally significant farmland. It's not just about soils. We dive deeper than that. Well, Chris explained a bit more about what it is, but I think it's powerful to see the spread of it across Rhode Island. It's confirmed as we drive around the state, and we can see that there's so much farmland in so many of our communities. It might be smaller parcels. It might be a bit more spread out in some areas, but even regions of the state that we don't necessarily think of as being high in agriculture have not just farmland, but nationally significant farmland. This is some of our country's best farmland, spread out all over the state of Rhode Island. Beth, if we can zoom in a bit, just to the left of Cranston, on this layer we see a good block of nationally significant farmland. Yeah, if we can zoom in on that, and then maybe flip over to the land use tab for a second. Yeah, so I want to zoom in a little bit in some of the communities just to show the power of these tools. We can see the huge amount of urban land use throughout Rhode Island. We can see the low density residential, and then we can see the agricultural land, and that agricultural land is divided on this into cropland and pasture. Beth, if we zoom out just a little bit and then switch over to the conversion, if you would. suddenly here we can see that westward expansion of the urban and the low density residential. We can see how that land use has moved onto that amazing cropland that exists. We have to remember that LDR is modeled. Even the UHD development is as good as some of our NRI database layers. The PBR values that we can show here, Beth, if you go over to the PBR, this is great parcel level data as communities are looking to try to prioritize their best farmland. This is great data to be able to use for that. This will hold up at a parcel level analysis. We can share really what went into building those PBR thresholds. Really encourage folks to dive into this data. I can geek out over it for hours, but I guess, Chris, in the interest of time, I ought to turn it back to you.
Great, thank you, Nate. And we can certainly come back and look at that if we have time during the Q&A period later. We're going to turn now to the policy scorecard, but before we do, we want to stop and get input from all of you on the webinar. We're interested in your perspectives on what you think will drive conversion over the next 10 to 20 years in Rhode Island. We do this now because as we're thinking about policy and policy responses, it's important to think about what people feel are going to be those conversion threats and ways that Rhode Island can address that through current, existing, or additional policy tools. You can vote for more than one. And if you're having trouble voting, it may be that you're in full screen mode and you need to come out of that to vote. Okay, Beth, what are we seeing here? This is pretty interesting. I will say that we have now done this webinar in 36 states, and you all are one of the few states, you're the exception rather than rule, to say that you are most concerned about more and poorly planned energy development and understanding how much of a driver that might be moving forward. Still, the other two are what we would expect to see, continued concern about sort of typical poorly planned and more commercial, residential, industrial development, and this concern about generational transfer and losing land as that land transfers between generations. So let's talk about that a little bit on the policy scorecard. And if you have questions, I would encourage you all to write them in the question panel, and we will get to them when we're done with a cruise through the policy findings. So our intent here with the scorecard is to highlight effective elements of state policies that address these historic drivers of conversion. So that's been, historically poorly planned development, lack of profitability in agriculture, and again, this fact that land is most vulnerable when it transfers between generations. AFT has been involved in policy development since our founding, but this is our first effort at a state policy scorecard. We also know that there are many ways that states support agriculture, and Ken talked about some of them. And this is not an attempt to score all of the ways that Rhode Island is supporting the business of farming, because we know that there are a number of different ways beyond just these 6 policies and programs. We picked 6 that tie directly to the land, and of which there were at least 10 states that had the policy or program. So we included, you can see the list over here on the left, purchase of agricultural conservation easement programs, known as farmland preservation or PDR programs. The Rhode Island Farmland Preservation Program is one of 28 state PDR programs. We looked at land use planning. So most states, including Rhode Island, delegate planning authority to local governments, and a lot of land use decisions are made locally. We know that. but states can play an important and active role in guiding that local planning and land use decisions. And on that front, as we'll show later, Rhode Island gets pretty high marks. Every state in the country has some kind of current use or agricultural use assessment program. We looked at these, so the Rhode Island Farm, Forest, and Open Space Program. We looked at agricultural district programs, not something that Rhode Island has. There are 14 states with them. They're programs that encourage landowners to form special areas to support agriculture, and they offer the landowners in districts a variety of protections and incentives. So some state district programs limit the use of eminent domain and or the siting of public facilities and infrastructure in districts. Some offer additional tax incentives, and some link their district enrollment to participation in their state PDR program. We then looked at two policies and programs that are getting at that land access and generational transfer issue. Farmlink Program, so Rhode Island is one of 11 states with a state-supported Farmlink Program. We know that there are many NGOs out there helping to connect land seekers with landowners who want their land to stay in agriculture, but we wanted to call out states specifically that are supporting this type of listing, linking, and matching work, given the pending transition of all of this agricultural land to a next generation. And then lastly, we looked at state leasing programs, so those that make state-owned land available to farmers and ranchers for agriculture. Rhode Island is one of the few states where that's a primary purpose of a lot of the land leased. In many other states, ag use is secondary to protecting wildlife habitat or just generating income for a public purpose. So we're going to scroll down. Here you can see how Rhode Island scores relative to other states. It's 8th overall with scores well above the median in 4 of the 6 categories. Ag districts not applicable. I'd note that while Rhode Island is shown as below the median in Farmlink, that median is only for states that have Farmlink programs. So the fact that Rhode Island has this type of program should really give you all great credit in knowing that you're well ahead of the curve on farm linking just by having a state program at all. So now we're going to dig into the factors behind the scores just a little bit. To do that here, you go here to this select policy or program. It's a drop-down menu, and we're going to start with PACE programs. And you will see that there are factors that go across the top that are what went into the score. And down below at the very bottom, you will see how each of these factors were scored and what went into it, so that we hope this is a useful way of looking to see how Rhode Island scored and how other states scored as well. So for PACE, you'll see that the Farmland Preservation Program ties for 8th here with Connecticut. States that scored higher here had a higher number of easements acquired per year, and that gets to, we recognize, to Ken's point, how much easements cost in Rhode Island. So it's completely understandable, that number there. I do want to point out that Rhode Island's per capita investment in its PACE program has been good. It's been 87 cents per capita. But just in comparison, those higher scoring states have a higher per capita investment. New Jersey's is $3.48 per capita, Vermont is $4, and Delaware is $6.02. You'll also see that several other states get points for having provisions in their program that promote ag use and ownership, such as affirmative covenants to farm and/or options to purchase at agricultural value. And before we leave PACE, I just want to note and to reiterate the point that Ken made about the value of some of the federal matching funds. The Agricultural Conservation Easement Program and its predecessor program have brought in almost $43 million in federal matching funds to Rhode Island's farmland preservation efforts. So NRCS is an important partner with that program and increasingly with the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. We hope that the funding increases in both of these programs in the 2018 Farm Bill, as well as key statutory changes, will allow Rhode Island partners to access additional ALE and RCPP dollars. Through the National Ag Lands Network, we will be working with partners in Rhode Island as elsewhere and with NRCS to try and maximize the utility of these programs for farmland protection in Rhode Island. So let's look quickly at just a few others. So at land use planning, Rhode Island gets great score here. It's 4th in the country. Gets points for having a state division of planning, for having a state guide plan, and for having land use goals around both compact development and farmland protection. It gets full points for requiring local comp plans and some points for requiring consistency between those local comp plans and those state goals. I just want to point out that the states that scored higher here, specifically Oregon and Washington, who are at the top here, they have a carrot and stick approach. They require all units of government to identify their important agricultural resources, and they require them to take steps to protect those resources and actually penalize them for failing to do so. So it seems to have been a carrot and stick approach that works, at least in those 2 states. On property tax relief, Farm, Forest, and Open Space Program gets good points here. Not much to say. I will note that you see that on the acres enrolled, it says 0. That was in part because the Department of Revenue does not keep an ongoing transparent tracking progress. In having talked to Ken, it's clear that the Division of Agriculture does track that, so we probably should have given you more points there than we did. Let's go to Farmlink, Beth. So as I mentioned, it's great here to see that Rhode Island has a program. Not surprisingly, given the smaller number of farms in general that the state has, it probably has fewer listings, and that's why the number of land postings is a little bit smaller than those at the top of the leaderboard. I would note that it doesn't get any points here for authority. We do think that having statutory authority for this type of program is important because that explicit authority means that the program is probably slightly more secure and more likely to survive changes in political leadership in the state. And then lastly, just noticing state leasing. Rhode Island is again at the top, close to the top here, does a terrific job relative to other states, and Ken was talking a little bit about that at the beginning. There wasn't a way here to give Rhode Island credit for the new farmland access program since it's not technically part of its farm leasing. It's more of a buy, protect, sell. But we do want to point out that we consider that a significant innovation and want to congratulate the state for having taken that step with that new program. And so with that, I'm going to stop. We'll come out of the website. If you have questions, please write them down now. And we're going to launch a poll as we come out of the website asking which policy or policies you think would be most valuable to focus on for Rhode Island going forward. And I note here that we were not able because there wasn't enough room to include either state-owned land or Farmlink. If you feel that one or both of those are the most important things to be focusing on or something else entirely, please write them in on the question panel. If not, we'll take a minute for people to vote. Okay, Beth, let's see where we are here. Great to see this. I'm going to guess that 100% on pace means that folks feel that Rhode Island just needs to keep its foot on the accelerator in terms of funding and support for the program, maybe some additional bells and whistles, and that land use planning is another area, particularly where some additional focus might be merited. I will say that the network, again, that I'm going to talk a little bit more about at the end, is going to host a series of webinars beginning this fall that are going to look deeply into each one of these categories of policies and programs, so that really folks can get an understanding for those ones that were at the top of the boards in terms of PACE or in terms of land use planning. How have they done it? What are they doing? What kind of success are they seeing? And what can we all learn from them? So I hope you all will join us for some of those policy webinars where you're particularly interested in. And with that, let me stop, Nate, and see if there are any, oh, whoops, before we get to questions, thank you for the prompt, Beth. I want to talk about this map. This is a data layer that we are creating, a national database of permanently protected farmland and ranch land. We did not include it in the spatial analysis here because there was not a comprehensive national data layer. So we are creating it. I do see some green in Rhode Island, which is great to see. If you are a land trust and have not heard from us and don't think that we have asked you for your data, please write your organization's name into the question panel and we will be in touch, because we want to be sure that we have everybody's information. So now we're going to stop and see if there are questions.
Sure. There's one question so far. I'd encourage folks as I'm tackling this one, if you've got questions, by all means, type them in the chat. And I think given how it's asked, I'll go first. But Chief Ayers, I'd love your thoughts on this topic as well. So give you a heads up there as I'm taking the first stab at it. So the question is that there's a lot of competition across New England for land, especially for solar. How does AFT feel about solar arrays on farmland? This is a question that I think we recognize that this is not the top concern in a lot of states, but I find it powerful that the only 2 states in the nation and where we've done these webinars that have said that this is their #1 concern are both New England states. To be frank, AFT finds ourselves a little bit in the middle on this topic. We're engaged in a joint project with some great partners to really dig deep on this issue here in New England and to understand the regulatory and incentive structure around solar development. We've begun to analyze how that framework really impacts the build out of solar. We've also really tried to work to understand what the land impacts of clean energy goals are for each state, i.e. how much land will it take to meet the state's goals. We really need to think hard about where we're building solar, how we incentivize it. We feel that those of us in the land protection community need to be really thoughtful about how and where we both embrace and obstruct solar, quite frankly. Our region needs solar to meet its clean energy goals, and we cannot meet those needs without putting some of that solar on farmland. That being said, AFT takes the stance that solar should not displace agriculture. This doesn't mean we cannot or should not build solar on farmland. We think they can coexist. We'd love to share some of our work around that. In fact, we could probably do an entire additional webinar on it. Chief Ayers, given that it was kind of the #1 threat that folks on the webinar expressed, I'd love to just kind of turn this generally to you and see if you or DEM kind of have any thoughts or concerns or doing anything specific on this topic.
Sure, great question. Challenging issue. Our governor has very aggressive goals for renewable energy adaptation in Rhode Island. We support that for many reasons. We all have, overarching things to think about, climate change being one of them. We have seen over time that the threat largely in Rhode Island, or the conversion, let's say, has happened on forestry land, less on agricultural land. In fact, I think certainly over the past 5 years, where a lot of this has occurred I've seen relatively few farms or parcels of farmland converted. We've seen a fair amount of forestry land. So I think that that's where our policy work needs to be focused on in terms of the value of forestry, protecting forestry land, and that's a subject of active conversation. I'm personally not in favor of, and you just said this as well, of converting especially valuable farmland to solar. I just think that the value of its value as food producing and product producing is equivalent, if not greater. The way I approach this is that farms almost always have marginal land. That's where the conversion should occur. I think there's plenty of opportunity to look at neither forestry land or good producing farmland, but land that's marginal, where we can focus our renewable energy development on. And I think that's true in Rhode Island as well. There's been a progression of thought that we need to do more to focus on renewable energy development on unused land, whether it's brownfields, carports, and I'm not saying unused, but used for where you don't have that conflict. So I think that's where it's all moving towards, and I think that's how this has all been developing over time. I think that we need to protect our ability to produce food into the future. And then another tool that we have, and many other states are exploring as well, is dual use, where you can allow for renewable energy development to occur on agricultural land and do it in such a way that you're not compromising the value of the land to produce food as well. So raised solar panels, for example, is one way of doing that. So we've written a regulation that promotes dual use, and that's one tool that we are working to promote to find that balance in Rhode Island.
Great, thank you, Ken. I'm curious if you have any other just general perspectives or thoughts on some of that spatial analysis, any of the mapping, any of the policy scorecard findings.
Well, I think the scorecard shows pretty progressive attitude in Rhode Island, and a long history of that in terms of planning and policies, and being innovative. The challenge is, as I mentioned at the top of this, is the high value of land. You know, in a small state, in the past, you know, since the early 1980s, we spent $100 million. That's an awful lot of money. $100 million just doesn't go as far in a state with such a high agricultural land value, high development pressure, as it does in many other states. You know, of that 100 million, which is split evenly relatively between state, federal, and local, you know, 36 of that million has been from state government, with, you know, challenging budget issues constantly. But it does show that we've always managed to, with support of the populace of the state, to carve out and put money towards farmland protection. So we'll continue to do that and go until, as far as we can. That will never end. There's never been a time where voters have turned down a farmland protection measure. It just shows, you know, how valuable it is and how strongly people feel about it. And I think that's just the path that we're on, and we're going to continue on that pathway.
Thank you. Thank you. Chris, any more questions?
Well, no, I'm not seeing any.
All right. Thank you. Given that, you know, time is not on our side to save our farmland, which is why AFT has just announced a bold goal of doubling the amount of permanently protected farmland by 2040 and reducing the rate of farmland conversion from 2,000 acres a day to 500 acres a day. Sorry, yeah, 500 acres a day by 2040. We know that to get to this goal, we will need to lock arms with many of the partners and practitioners on this call and others around the US who are deeply concerned about saving the land that sustains us. So we hope that you'll all be part of that movement as well. Jamie, why don't you walk us through the next slide?
Great, thanks, Nate. Yeah, so I just wanted to share now some ways that AFT will be strengthening our commitment to farmland protection, and specifically how this will impact Rhode Island. So the first is establishing the National Ag Land Network, which Chris has mentioned a couple times, and I'll skip over this now actually, because I believe Chris will mention it a bit later. The second is, we're building our capacity to better serve New England. So we're increasing our staff here in the region to focus on farmland protection, policy, education, and conservation planning. We're protecting more farmland ourselves and with partners. So we're partnering with other land trusts and organizations to pursue innovative land protection projects in Southern New England, and we hope to do so soon in Rhode Island. We look forward to working with the Rhode Island Land Trust Council and other local land trusts to bring our expertise to bear where appropriate. We're advocating for stronger state and federal policies, so we're working with various partners to support Rhode Island's state farmland protection program and funding. We're pushing for federal funding for various Nrcs programs that have often been critical to farmland protection efforts in Rhode Island. And we're seeking more meaningful relationships with partners in Rhode Island as we build the staff capacity that we mentioned earlier. Promoting more research-based decision-making. We plan to use the findings from this Farms Under Threat study to guide our activities on the ground, and we're actively building on this research by projecting future threats from development and climate change out to the year 2040. We're also finalizing the findings of a joint 2-year research project on solar development policies and practices across New England, and incorporating them into our advocacy efforts across the region. And then lastly, we're providing direct financial support to farmers. We're working with farmers to help them access and secure farmland and to fill the gaps in infrastructure on their farms by providing grants through several different grant programs. One of those, which you may have heard about, we had a Farmer Relief Fund, which is a specific COVID-19 response that provides direct cash relief to farms that have suffered losses due to this global pandemic. As well as through our New England Farmer Microgrants program, which I administer, that we launched this year and will continue into next year, which works with farmers more closely and helps them to increase their farm productivity and their land security. So with that, I'll pass it back to you, Nate.
Thank you very much, Jamie. So what can Rhode Island do? Rhode Island can analyze and map agricultural land trends and conditions. We feel that while many states have done a lot, there's only one state that has a truly thorough understanding of its farmland resources, and that's California. We really think that states need a far better grasp of what they have and where they're losing farmland. We think we've developed some foundational tools here that others can use to get a better understanding, but we really encourage states to really analyze their farmland and their farmland loss at a much deeper level. Rhode Island can strengthen or adopt a coordinated suite of policies, especially around climate change. Rhode Island has shown a real willingness to use farmland protection in support of agricultural viability as effective tools to address environmental issues, but these are also powerful climate mitigation tools and motivators that provide significant opportunities to help farms, farmland, and our communities as a whole. We can support farm viability and access to land. AFT sees farm viability challenges as one of the most significant threats to farmland conversion as well. Chief Ayers mentioned this in his earlier answers to some of my questions as well, but vibrant farms with stable markets are under far less threat to conversion. I think we all know that. Population density frequently brings easier access to markets, but it also brings serious challenges for many farmers. Rhode Island can continue to support programs that really support farm viability. We can all either begin or more aggressively and proactively work to address issues of farmland access, especially for Black, Indigenous, and farmers of color. Some of these tools can include tax credits, land leasing programs, and include direct financial support through grants or interest-free loans. While we know the census is not a complete picture, we can use it to see some trends around farmland access and new farmers. And it does show that while the number of non-white farmers are increasing, both across New England and in Rhode Island, most don't own their own land, and many are new and beginning farmers. Programs like the New Entry Sustainable Farming Project, the African Alliance of Rhode Island, and others are supporting immigrant, refugee, and farmers of color with training and access to land. But states, local officials, and volunteers can work more directly with Black, Indigenous, and farmers of color communities to build relationships and better understand their land access and resource needs. Many do need more secure tenure on their land through either affordable ownership or leases. And while Rhode Island is doing really well on the land access front, there is always more that can be done, no matter how well we are doing. Planning for agriculture, not just around it. Rhode Island scores really well on planning generally. But as Chris mentioned, there's no requirement that farmland protection be a part of the planning process for communities where it's relevant. And as we saw from that nationally significant farmland layer, and when we take into account urban agriculture, which our mapping is unable to capture at this point, it is relevant in every single community. Save the best, but don't forget the rest. We encourage more investment in farmland protection generally. In a densely populated state like Rhode Island, despite ultra high land values, protection really will pay off, and it's always a sound community investment. Chief Ayers, you mentioned that as one of the real high priorities as well, and I can't agree more. We encourage all states as well, including Rhode Island, to view their higher PVR lands as particularly important and worthy of targeted protection. We acknowledge that all farmland has significant benefits for agriculture as well as important co-benefits, but our highest PVR lands are also the most threatened by conversion to both UHD and LDR conversion. When we look at farmland beyond just its basic soil ratings, we really understand that it's not just in our most fertile valleys. We can protect farmland across the state from looking at it in this perspective. So Chris, how about back to you?
Thank you, Nate. So not seeing any more questions at the moment. I think let me talk for just a minute about these two resources that you see on your screen here, and then I'll turn it back to Ken for any last perspectives, and then back to you, Nate. So, and we also want to launch one last poll. Actually, Beth, let's do that now, and I can talk while we're launching it. Through both the Farmland Information Center and the National Agricultural Land Network, AFT has always committed and is going to continue to commit to providing technical assistance to build the collective capacity of people engaged in both planning around farmland and encouraging farmland protection. We know that there are a lot of needs and things that we can provide in terms of technical assistance, and so we hope that you will let us know which one of these things you think are the highest priority of what you could use help with. And while we're waiting for people to vote, let me talk for a minute about the Farmland Information Center, which we have had for decades. It's a collaboration with USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, and it is a national clearinghouse for information around agricultural land. It's largely focused on protection and planning, increasingly focused on land access. So if you are interested in seeing what other land access approaches and tools are being used around the country, you can go to the FIC, as we call it, if you are interested in looking or asking questions about easement, deed terms, and conditions. You can find that kind of information there. There's much, if you're looking for information like our cost of community services and other research that helps to explain the benefit of both permanent farmland protection and just farmland in general. We have a wealth of information there, including a couple of studies, our Greener Fields reports that talk about the importance of farmland and ranchland to climate change mitigation. So I hope you go on the FIC, explore it, and if you have questions, feel free to ask the expert either by email or that phone number. Looking here quickly at this technical assistance that people think would be helpful, great to know about local ag land protection plans, that there's an interest in, more information about ag conservation easements, and state and local policy tools. So again, be on the lookout for additional information on the policy front. But here, as I close out, the National Agricultural Land Network is something that we have formally launched this year. It is formalizing something that AFT has done for a long time, which has been to bring people together to both collectively improve our knowledge of the successes and challenges of saving farmland. And when I say that saving, it means not just permanently protecting it, but keeping that stable land base so important to the ag economy around the country and to communities. We want, again, to help people who are working in this space professionally to have a way that they can expand their knowledge and be thinking not just about what are the best protection tools and planning tools, but how do we connect these tools to other objectives, whether that's around climate change mitigation or water quality or wildlife habitat or local food security. There are many things that we can learn from each other and innovations that are happening around the country, and that's the intent of the network. So if you're interested in joining, please go to thatfarmland.org/NALN. Feel free to email me or call me if you have questions. Let me just say that URL at the bottom is the URL for the website. And I hope everybody will continue to explore it and use the information that we have provided. And so with that, let me turn it back really quickly to you, Ken, for any last thoughts from your end.
Well, let me say, first of all, that I appreciate the work of American Farmland Trust over the years. You are leading the charge nationally and serving as a voice for many of us on this issue. And so thank you for putting this together and for all the work that you all do. And also to the partners in Rhode Island, some of who are on the line, who play such an essential role. As I mentioned at the beginning of this, oftentimes the state these days, because of all the work that's being done in Rhode Island, sometimes is a minor and supporting partner for a farmland protection project. We might be contributing 20, 30, or 45%, and the rest of it's coming from the federal government or from local organizations, and that's shows the balance and the diversity of work that's being done, not just state government, but all across the board. That's essential. I would only other say in closing words that when you think about how Rhode Island's made up, and that's true in many states in New England with a very urban component to our land base and a long history of industry, that we need to think of farmland in the broadest terms. We actually use our farmland protection money to protect small inner city lots in Providence, to protect urban gardens from development and community agriculture. And if we're going to truly think about food security, it's just not the vast expanses of farmland, 100, 300,000 acres, but also half-acre, 5-acre lots that are all around the state and all around this country. And farmland protection, frankly, needs to include that, and food security needs that to be a basis of it as well. And I say that's how we have to look at this going forward, and remember that protecting any land which has a capacity to produce food and create food security from development is important.
Thank you, Ken. That's a really powerful reminder. Our mapping tools here could only go so far as to understanding what was farmland and what was not, but I think it's a powerful reminder that we've got a lot of work to do as well to try to quantify all of that other farmland that exists within that urban layer. So thank you for that.
Sure.
Thank you very much, everybody, for being on the webinar today. We look forward to engaging with you more. Thank you, Chief Ayers, for joining us. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Jamie. Have a great day, everybody, and be safe.
Take care.